Welcome everyone back to a wonderful episode of the Transformation Leaders Podcast. I am Sean Ennis. I am joined with my partner in crime, David Soden. And today we're talking about small language models. So the first thing I like to tell people about large language models is that most business use cases are completely useless for large language models. You have to actually add data to the mix. And all of you out there should understand what embedding is. And that is basically sidecarding a large language model with your data so that you filter your queries through your data. And this is what people talk about RAG models and such. It's a very common technique to essentially add data. Now, fine-tuning allows you to directly insert into a large language model your data. It's costly, it's time intensive. You need a lot of skills to do it. But small language models is what we're talking about today, and how we're able to take a large language model and make it, condense it, or what's called distillation, into a small language model. So basically, think of it as two databases with data. You select a subset from the large and insert it into the small language model. So this is really, really big in the news the last month. I'm sure you all have heard about DeepSeek, and they have shown a lot of capabilities of distillation as a technique to essentially make a higher performant, more focused data set language model. So, David, what are your thoughts about small language models and how we get there?
Thought you were going to say sloths. I was like, yeah, they're cute, cuddly, and slow. But yeah, no, small language models essentially is, for the most part, any of the workflows that I have seen in business or have even put together, usually they involve some sort of aggregation of information and contextual prompts to provide additional information, but the large language models taking it all in context to simply just repeating or throwing something out. And it's usually quite simple. And it usually has to do with language or some sort of creative writing, or at least just understanding basic text-based inferences. And for those, small language models really do excel. When you're getting into some of the more advanced or broad general ranging, maybe searching and querying where, the sky's the limit. But if you're simply just looking for creative writing or text completions or things of that nature, small language models is where it's at. Otherwise, more of your heavy lifting, your data analytics, and there's even small language models specifically tailored towards very particular things. There's another place out there in the internet for those that are somewhat geeky, but otherwise, if you're not, don't worry about it. Tell the people that you work with where to go get this information. It's on huggingface.com. You will find pretty much just about any and everything that you could want, including your kitchen sink, up there with regards to X language models. And so there's a whole bunch of information out there. Distillation is all of the rage now because of DeepSeek and the new techniques and the white paper that they had produced on how they were able to do what they needed to do. The only thing I will do, a quick call out and sidecar, really quick, I don't want to get too deep into it, is that you want to make sure that you're being very ethical and you want to make sure that you're being very conscientious of what you're distilling. Make sure that you own it and you're not using something that could land you into a lawsuit, because DeepSeek did that. I'm of the opinion, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm of the opinion DeepSeek stole a bunch of large language models, distilled it down for its own purposes, while super creative and a very interesting technique for time savings and compilation. It should be noted that you should find a large language model that's potentially open source, that you have rights and access to, fine tune it, supplement it with your data, distill it down, whatever. I actually said those steps a little bit backwards. But in any event, the point is just make sure that you have the ownership rights to it. Otherwise, once you get in there and you get this thing ingrained and embedded and all this other stuff, it's really, really hard to go back in and change it after the fact. So, but
Yeah.
that was a little bit of a rant or whatever, but yeah, that's kind of my take on small language models and where they fit into the bigger picture.
Yeah, there's a lot of allegations, I would call it that DeepSeek has used other people's property. But it's a great point. You will see in Hugging Face that distillation is a very common practice, and that you'll see people say, here's the open source model I took, and I distilled it to this. So you'll see things that are really focused on coding. You'll see things that are really focused on content. There'll be one that's focused really well on translation. So there's lots of different working parts and capabilities here. But where small language models are so valuable, and we talked a little bit about it last week, is around having very, very compact and efficient models. And there is a common mistake that a lot of transformation leaders are performing, in that they think that you should have one large language model, and then you'll have one agent talk to one large language model, and it will do everything. This is the monolithic approach. Now, all of you, when I said the word monolithic, should have twitched a little, because we all went through our growing pains to understand that monolithic designs do not scale, do not grow, and do not evolve very well. So small language models will allow you to have a much smaller footprint, meaning it'll be cheaper, and that you will be able to do a more focused set of requirements. Because if it has fewer parameters that you've selected out of the larger model, you will have a faster response. And that means that you can either A, have a more scalable experience, or B, you will have a cheaper experience. And faster and cheaper is great when you have both, and that's really where distillation is so important. Is people look at the cost of running a lot of Gen AI solutions at scale, and they freak. Small language models, I have some that I run on local machines using Intel architecture, x86. So things are possible at a smaller level that just are not at a larger level.
That is true. Very true. The other thing, too, I want to call out is some of the way that the architecture has changed with this new agentic AI that's out there. So we did a couple of episodes talking about it, and I think we had one couple weeks ago towards the beginning of this year talking about agentic AI. But as you may have recalled, we had a supervisor and we had some example demo agents or workers. And so the orchestration was the supervisor, but each one of the workers did something very specific. A good place to go out there and find these small language models is Cornell University. They've got a whole bunch of really great minds out there. One that comes to mind is, I think I'm probably going to get it wrong, R star. It's a lowercase r and then star with a capital S dash math. And it's a particular small language model just for doing algorithms and mathematical calculations. And so that's all it does. If you ask it about policies or procedures or politics or anything other than math, it's going to bomb. And so it is really good if you have a worker in an agentic AI type of scenario that its job is to sit there and do complex calculations and algorithmic math. And if that's what it does, then that's great. But the whole point here is that you get agentic AI done and orchestrated, and as you're architecting it, if you can find a small language model that does the task of what that agent is supposed to do, which is small and narrow, you won't have to create a 500-foot prompt. You might only have to put, a couple of lines because it understands intrinsically what you're talking about without having to write all this extra prompting, telling it, don't do this, ignore this, and try to shape and mold it, even with one-shot, multi-shot type of prompting. I have personally experienced frustrations with the large language model because it keeps trying to do other things that it knows about. And if it's ignorant and it doesn't know anything other than this one or maybe broadly narrowed thing, then of course it's going to do much better. So keep in mind as you're doing agentic AI and as you come up with these agents that do a task for you, try to find and couple it with a small language model. And if you're proprietary in an industry, I don't know, I'll pick on either health or even insurance or whatever the case may be. Those are very niche things, including manufacturing. So it may be worth it to distill, as we talked about earlier, a large language model down into a special area of expertise in just your one area. So those are some of the things that I would talk about with regards to architecture and consideration when you're trying to figure out how do I even figure out the best use case for a small language model.
Yeah. Well, we have a question from the audience today around, give some examples of what small language models are. So for the people out there familiar with OpenAI, and OpenAI has GPT-3, 3.5, 4. Now they have 4.5. They have 4.0, 4.0 mini. All of these are different models. Now, what I know that is for me, the quintessential small language model is the empty model, embeddings. If you guys know the embedding model that they offer, they have that one. So that it has no data, so that you can pair that up with your RAG model and effectively will have as fast as possible. The bigger the model, the slower and more costly it will be. So if you're looking at the 4.0 versus 4.0 mini, mini may very well be a distillation, but they don't really tell you that. So you really won't know in the closed source models. But David, as you stated before, Hugging Face, you can go through and look, and how you can tell is how many parameters. There's some out there that are, for example, Llama 3.2 has a 8 billion parameter system. They have a 64 billion parameter. They have a trillion parameter, 2 trillion parameter, I think. So the number of parameters indicate how large the model is, and the smaller the model, the more likely. So let's talk a little bit about, before we get into, well, first of all, want to cover the next slide, and I think we already have, is why you would do this, which is lowering the requirements, meaning cheaper and faster inference time. So faster and cheaper is why you do this. And so basically, let's say, David, you made a great point, healthcare. So we're going to have a health bot, and that health bot is going to answer everything about drugs and drug interactions, let's say, right? So that if you're at a drugstore, and before you talk to the pharmacist, you scan your card, it knows who you are, and it knows what drug that you take, and it knows your prescriptions, and then you can click them and say, what's the drug interactions between this, right? So that would be the experience that you would be building. Well, that particular experience doesn't need to know that the capital of France is Paris. So you don't need to add that to the model. If you add extraneous data to the model, it will slow it down. Now, what I would do if I was being asked, which I've been asked in this particular use case, what do? Well, you go to Hugging Face, and then you look around if somebody has already distilled this for you in an open source model. So fortunately for us, there's a lot of people out there who are testing these techniques and posting their outcomes in an open source way that you can get access to. And I would definitely recommend checking that out, because you can reduce the cost and increase the speed significantly. Typically, you don't get faster and cheaper, but with small language model, you get both.
That's true. I want to call out something that I think might be a source of confusion for a lot of folks, especially when it comes to small language models. And there's two perspectives that one might think of a small language model. And there may be drivers why you're looking for it, and they may vary for you as an individual. So first of all, if you're looking for cost cutting, performance enhancing, in other words, run time faster at inference, and you're not too worried about niche, like I just called out the R-star math model. Now, that is a math model specifically for mathematics, right? Like I said, if you try to just have a general conversation other than like hi, it's really not that great, right? It's just meant for math. So that is domain proprietary or more domain specific. And that is an example of an SLM. Now, Sean had mentioned earlier, and we had been talking about all on the podcast here so far about SLMs and distillation and the parameterization. I want you to think of a text file. A text file might have a bunch of CRM dump data in it, and it might be 8 megabytes in size, which is pretty big for a text file. It's a lot of data. However, data compresses really easy. If you were to put it in a zip file, you could still get a single zip file with compression, I don't know, under a meg, maybe a couple of 100K, if that. And so it compresses really good. That's great. However, if I've got a million rows of data that compress down from 8 megabytes to a couple 100K, it's still the same data. It's still the same swath of data. So one of the things to, as you're considering SLMs and you're looking at parameterization, you're looking at quantization, you're looking at distillation, be careful, because you got to look at the base root model. So whether I have 100 billion or whether I got 8 billion or whether I've got an SLM called, for example, what is it? Tiny Llama is an example of an SLM, but Tiny Llama is just, it's an SLM based on its size and how much computational resources it takes to use it. The problem, though, is its corpus of training, its vast swath of knowledge still exists, but because you're randomly cherry picking pieces and compressing to reduce the file, to reduce its effectiveness, it still has that broad knowledge problem that is typical of large language models, but it's even worse in some cases because now you've basically picked out the holes and it's trying to figure out how to best give it. So you're going to get a lot more hallucination. So there's two types of SLMs, I guess, to summarize, is that there is domain-specific SLMs, and then there is the ultra-compressed, ultra-small, but it's still trained on this swath of information, which means it could potentially be really ineffective. So you're going to have to really test it a lot, because if you do something like Tiny Llama versus, I don't know, Llama 70B or the mammoth, what is it, 402 billion parameter, like it's massive. You can't even run it on a personal PC. You have to run it in a cloud, typically with a bunch of those, what are those, HX100s or whatever they are by NVIDIA, chained together to run this thing in any decent form. So the point here is, and the takeaway is that if you're looking for small language models just to save money at inference time to make things faster, you could get away with a compressed version of a larger language model. And yes, it's smaller in size, but it doesn't necessarily, and I'm using air quotes, fit into the cliche term of small language model. So just, there's a lot of ways of looking at it. And as people talk about it, and as you look at it for what your needs are, just be really, really careful about, what is my end goal? What is my outcome? And what am I trying to do? And so, it just really depends on your use case. I mean, I could go on and on, I guess, but I'll leave it there.
And that's a good segue to, what your use case is. What this does, what distillation and small language models do, is it opens the opportunity for different use cases, right? If you understand cloud use cases, they're different from edge use cases, right? Being able to run a assistant right with the developer on their laptop is different than running from a cloud. There may be different security requirements. There may be different drivers for that. You may want to limit what code they're allowed to code in. For example, let's say you are a PHP shop. So you don't need to have a whole bunch of coding assistants for Perl or C++ or JavaScript, so that you can take a very small model and go. And this is really where I see, and David, I'd love to hear your perspective on this, the future of language models in general. I think that we're going to get to a point where the accuracy is what it is, the reasoning is what it is, and we're going to go into the verticalization of language models. And that means small language models to me. David?
Yeah, I see the future, and based on what I'm seeing and reading, is there's this whole new paradigm, again, with the agentic movement, where essentially everything, this concept of a large language model, while, all well and good, there's only so much information, and we've pretty much hit it to the point where companies like OpenAI, they've got their hands on just about every piece of information they can possibly think. Unless you're, an owner of a large, for example, Facebook and Llama, they use all of their social media data and posting, but it's pretty much the same as what you're going to get anywhere else. And then there's web scrapers. So even if you don't own Facebook, you can scrape Facebook. So the point here is the knowledge of what's there, what's out there, other than maybe current events or current happenings. There's really not much new information. And we keep talking about, or there has been conversations around generating synthetic data. Well, the problem with synthetic data is it's artificial. It's not based on anything factual. And so we already know hallucination's a problem as it is. So the way that I've seen some of the discussions coming from a next strategy and approach is coming up with a base core model that is considered general and good enough. Now, there are more modulistic type of approaches to this. So these SLMs are going to be essentially daisy chained. And so if you think of a large language model like a Rubik's Cube, and you look at all the little squares that make up the Rubik's Cube as they twist and turn, in this use case, think of each of those little tiny sub blocks inside of the Rubik's Cube like a small language model. And that whole thing is brought together as a large language model because you have a bunch of small ones. So essentially what I'm talking about and what I'm hearing is that things are going to be broken into a lot of these smaller components, but they're going to be chained together because they make them much more manageable. Inference time and computation time is much easier. But there's this whole argument / what is the best way to build the Rubik's Cube. If you've ever taken one apart, because I did when I was little and I tried to cheat, there's this structure underlying where you got basically one in the middle and one on the sides like this, and then you got nothing in the middle. So that's like the structure that holds the cube. And so that's what they're talking about now. What is going to be the glue to bolt all these small language models into this larger one without having to do with what they have right now? The problem is they don't know how it works on the inside. So tearing it apart and isolating into these little cubes is part of what they're trying to do, because they're trying to figure out, how does this happen? And the only thing I can think of is if you have a phone, and I got one right here, you got a latitude and a longitude, as well as some of these, what are they, altimeter. It tells you essentially how up in your elevation. So you got an XYZ axis essentially on your phone. What that means is that anywhere in planet Earth, you know exactly where you are at any particular place and how high in the elevation that that you are there. And so with that being said, that's a coordinate for a very specific piece of information. Well, imagine every single person on Earth, if they had an XYZ coordinated access, we're all over the place. And if you think about what each one of us know as individuals, our experiences, like there's so much overlap, a lot of shared information, and a lot of known knowledge that each of us knows. And these large language models are just as chaotic. So there's all of this blending. So imagine taking, I don't know, pick a popular TV show. We'll pick a TV sitcom of Seinfeld or Friends or something from the 90s, right? And from there, you know, if you extrapolate the knowledge out of every human that knows anything about it, plus all of the wherever it is media that's out there and all the text that's all over the internet, it's everywhere. And these large language models are the same. So again, they're trying to figure out how do we pull and extract all of this. The good news is that it is a mathematical calculation to it, but getting it out is like pulling teeth, and there's such a mystery in it. It's getting harder and harder for them to try to figure this out, although they are getting better with some of the tools. And I saw, and I didn't understand fully, that if you look through the language of the DeepSeek white paper, they talk about some algorithmic approaches and how that is possible, where they were able to use and lock onto certain pieces of information, and they were using that in their distillation technique. So there is hope, there is promise to that. But as that technology gets better, I'm pretty sure you're going to see a lot of small language models, very specific, like the math one. You're going to have a math one, a coding one, maybe a history one, maybe
that's already happening.
And you're going to start getting this much, much more prevalent. But as far as it being out in the mainstream, I think that's where you're going to start seeing the next business opportunities. As that comes up, you're going to have basically companies selling these modules, but until somebody comes up with this standardization of the glue to hold the cube together, then it's the Wild West, and we're still there. But yes, all of this stuff is happening. So that's kind of where I see the future.
And really appreciate the engagement today from everybody out there, because we have another question, and that is, how do BERTs fit in? So as I understand it, BERTs are very minuscule models that you can add on to. BERTs came from this concept. If you've ever used your phone and you sent a text, and then maybe you typed a word that you shouldn't be using, and it autocorrects to a word like shut instead of whatever you were trying to type, you know, you've just interacted with a BERT and trying to predict and correct your language for you so that you don't send a text to somebody you shouldn't have, right? Or, you know, and this autocorrect feature, which has been around for quite some time in the arena, is your prototypical BERT. Now, the difference between distillation of a large language model into a small language model and using a BERT is that BERTs are essentially empty or have a very small set of data, and you are fine-tuning, you're adding data to the BERT versus you are removing data from a large language model. It gets you the same small language model outcome, but there are risks. And I think that kind of is a great segue for me to kind of jump into the risks side of things. Oops. And bias, ethical considerations, and accuracy. So, you know, anything to do with Gen AI is empirical testing is required. Let me start there, because yes, you could start by a small model and add data on, or you could start at a large model and select those. It takes you the same direction. The question is do you have the data, and do you know what data? And so you could go through and you can say, okay, my previous example, PHP. I'm going to say, I'm going to go into Quen or Llama 3 or whatever, and I'm going to say, I'm going to carve out all the parameters that have PHP in it, and I'm just going to add those, right? But what didn't you include? Well, you didn't include how to do a GitHub merge. You didn't include standard coding documentation. You didn't include, what typical compilation errors are, or what a 404 error is. So you may miss something. Now, on the flip side, with BERT, you have the other issue, and that is, how are you going to find all the data you need in a curated form and get it added to the BERT model? So is addition through subtraction better than trying to build your own model? And, I am sure this is a great opportunity to open up the comments and let everybody chime in on this. But before I listen to all you, I'd love to hear what David has to say.
Yeah, so I think one of the things I wanted to do, if you don't mind, I want to bring another resource here. I'm trying to figure out how to pull this in here. Okay, so for those of you that are not as technical, or even if you are technical, so a lot of the things that Sean's talking here, because a lot of times, we talk about stuff and we take for granted that we're always here. We just mentioned Hugging Face and stuff like that. But I wanted to bring up in Hugging Face, and I'll put a comment in the comments where we publish all of this here, and you'll have a link to this, what I'm showing. But the bottom line is, all of your BERTs that we're talking about are here. One of the ones that I like to use a lot is the CTRL. This is simply just broken down by doing text or text completions or everything about controlled text. And so it's really small for that. And then there's almost, like the joke is, there's an app for that from the Apple App Store. Well, there's a model for that, or there's a BERT for that. And so all of these BERT / CTRL / minis and, large, fat, small, skinny, sideways, whatever, they're all up here, and there's a plethora of these models. So just wanted to bring that up so that everybody is understanding that Face has that list of models, and you can either search or you can scroll through and read till your heart's content, because you'll probably never be finished, because as soon as you've gotten through one, they've updated the same one that you just read. Anyway, it's like drinking from a fire hose. But we'll put the comments in the chat here. I'll start off with the comment section here, but it will not go probably all the way through. There we go.
And again, it's funny because I had a bit of nostalgia right there. One of the slogans of a startup I did about 8 years ago was around Hive ML. The models are the magic, right? And that was something that I truly believed back then. If you could create bespoke singular models that solve the business problem that everybody is experiencing, you could rinse and repeat. And that's where I see the potential for small language models, which I think is a good way to kind of move to, what we're seeing. That small language models are coming. They're already here. If you saw the Hugging Face that David showed everybody, and that they're going to continue to evolve. And then they're going to allow you to have not just the large language model sledgehammer that you have, but perhaps a scalpel, perhaps a pair of scissors, perhaps, a magnifying glass. Again, a lot of people are kind of seeing or thinking of large language models as the iPhone, right? The beauty of the iPhone was, and all smartphones, was they can do so many things on a platform.
Yep.
I don't see large language models as a platform. I see it as a tool. And that tool is very broad and limited. And the more data you have, meaning large, the more opportunities you have for hallucinations and lack of accuracy. We've proven this time and time again with our clients that heavily curated data provides higher accurate results. But the larger amount of data you have to curate, the more costly the whole process is.
Yeah.
So we've seen use cases out in the marketplace that you have organic data curation processes. So as you need it, you curate it with humans and humans in the loop. And this is why the company that me and David work for, they firmly believe that AI without humans provides no business value or very little. It is the symbiosis between humans and AI that is going to win. And with small language models, it means that the AI will be just as tuned to a certain skill set as the person is. If you're doing crypto work, you need a Rust developer, not a JavaScript developer, right? So small language models would be very typical to that. David?
Yeah, the other thing too I want to call out, and something we haven't talked about at all, is multimodal. And multimodal small language models is all of another rage. And you hit the nail on the head almost, because you were going there. And I was like, oh my God, we completely forgot to even bring this up. So Google Pixel, I think Sean has an iPhone. So Apple Intelligence or Apple AI. You've got, I think even Tesla's getting in the game with Grok now and their Tesla phone that they've got coming out. But the point is, Samsung's got one. Everybody's coming up with their own version of a small language model that fits on a mobile device, and it's multimodal. So it can do vision, it can do text, it can do voice, it can do, that's what multimodal is when we start talking about a multimodal small language model. It's small, it's compressed, but it's like, again, back to that Rubik's Cube thing, each block does its own specific task in a domain, I think is maybe even a better way of saying it, whether it's vision or speech or or text. And then within that, it's others. So you're seeing a lot of these small language models really, really take over. And the greatest example of that is what's going on your mobile phone, because there is a race, not only because the hardware is pretty much tapped out, right? Like the mobile phone is the mobile phone. Ever since the iPhone came out and everybody's come out with, the competitors to it, the hardware's, it gets better. Yes, of course. But by and large, you could go 3, maybe even 4 years and not trade out your phone. And as long as they didn't do updates to make your phone slower, it would last a lot longer. But the bottom line is the next race is going to be how they're going to implement AI on these devices. And it's all going to be from these multimodal, easy for me to say, small language models, because I can't say SLMs.
So I firmly believe that this is the next evolutionary steps that you're going to hear from Gen AI is the verticalization. And that's kind of what we want everybody to remember about what we're saying here as we look beyond the now into the future. And that's basically why we're talking about small language models now, because you could start using them. BERT has been around since the 90s, I think. It's adding and creating data is the difficult part. Distillation, though, allows a layman like you or me the ability to take an open source model and whittle it down like that proverbial block of marble, so that you could create the sculpture that you want, which I believe is a more business viable solution. So, when it comes to AI, it's about your use case. It's about which human you're pairing up to it and what the business value you're hoping to get out of it. So I think small language models will give you that opportunity to be more agile and nimble as you're trying to get business value. David, I'll give you the last word for today.
Yep. No, just keep an eye on podcasts that we have every Wednesday at 12 o'clock noon. You can visit us online at the transformationleaderspodcast.com. And we also have YouTube channels, and Sean and I are on LinkedIn. We also have a LinkedIn group that you can join us up there. I think that any questions that you have, and obviously this is a fluidic type of situation when we're talking about large or even small language models and AI in general. Sean and I do our best to keep up and drink from this fire hose so that you don't have to keep up with it. So reach out to us. We're more than happy to have a conversation. Until next week, we'll see you later. Have a great day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.